I think it's important for people to understand how the NHS was before COVID struck, and your question is needs to be addressed. In the decade leading up to the end of 2019, we'd seen a defunding of the NHS. So the historical investment in the NHS in that decade was around 1% increase, but natural inflation for the NHS since 1948 averaged around 4%. So what you had was a decade of a 3% cut every year in real terms. So you had the defunding. On top of that, since the financial crash, the NHS lost about 38,000 beds across the NHS, resulting in the UK having the lowest beds per head of population in the whole of Western Europe. So we were very deprived of beds, very low capacity, but we entered into the pandemic with another problem, which was a staffing crisis. So 100,000 vacancies within the NHS, of which 40,000 were nurses and 10,000 were doctors. So you had an NHS on its knees before COVID. And you mentioned exercise sickness. Well, this was a pandemic preparedness exercise carried out in 2016. And although the full document hasn't been made public and is subject to a potential court case to get this made public, it appears that the obvious things were not done, and that was to stockpile PPE, to make sure there was sufficient capacity in intensive care, having enough qualified staff, and ventilators to put people on life support should they need it. A lot of those recommendations, which are blatantly obvious, were not carried out. So the government made an active decision not to prepare. And the result was, when the pandemic struck, there was a massive shortage of PPE, there was a logistical chaos, and we found out that the supply chain had been privatized. The company looking after the stockpile had changed hands several times. But the key thing that also happened in that decade was a major piece of legislation, the Health and Social Care Act 2012, which effectively abolished the existing world-renowned, very robust public health infrastructure. So it shut down public health labs. It sacked, I think it was 10,000 staff who were running Britain's public health. It dismantled the local organization of public health, and it downgraded the leadership. So you no longer had to be a specialist in public health to be a director of public health. So this was a disaster waiting to happen.
By the way, I think the UN has had to move away from using that line, Build Back Better, because it was appropriated by Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. And of course, the UN isn't allowed to be seen to be supporting any political party at any given time. But no, I think the interesting thing is that, not only is the General Assembly essentially moved towards advocating universal healthcare, in other words, healthcare systems based on a UK type system of a national health service funded at source through taxation and what have you, but that it has tried to set out, its ideas for essentially having a global response to this crisis. And of course, the real problem it's faced from the outset this time round has been that in the time of Trump, in the time of Bolsonaro, in the time of Putin, and Boris Johnson to a degree too, you've got individual member states following their own unilateral policies in many respects. So this kind of multilateral response has been much more difficult to bring together. And what's been very striking is that many of the East Asian countries, who of course have got good experience of dealing with similar kinds of pandemics in the past, appear to have got a pretty rapid grip on the situation. And that also includes Australasia, it includes other countries as well. Britain, as you know, Chris, has been way down the league in terms of its response, the efficiency of its response, particularly when it comes to what the WHO have been recommending right from the outset. The most basic thing, and I'm not a public health expert, but I did follow all of these things. So Track, trace, and isolate. That was what the World Health Organization was advocating from the outset. Britain began by doing that, but as we know, for some reason, we're not entirely clear, but it moved towards this idea of having herd immunity. And of course, the pandemic then took hold. Now, in other respects, Britain has been late, but moved quickly. But after a late start, has improved its response. But at the end of the day, we have to look at mortality rates, and the reality is this country has got one of the highest mortality rates in the world. We were ill prepared. Without the National Health Service, we would have been in such deeper problems than we have been. We didn't have PPE, and we needed it. And of course, one of the other big stories, which will probably grow, I mean, there've been one or two people who are raising this in the press, but also, Labour MPs such as Dan Carden in Liverpool, who was onto this quite early on about the sort of the contracts, the whole issue of contracts. Admittedly, in the middle of a pandemic, you've got to move quickly. You've got to try and get all the PPE and all the rest of it. One of the big issues I think is going to emerge is, a potential corruption on a major scale. That's a big issue. But the British response has been a mixed bag. The mortality rate has been very bad.
Yeah, no, indeed. And I just wonder, given your experience at the UN, and I only gave a very truncated CV when I was introducing there, because I know you've had and continue to have involvement with the UN. What attention do you think the British ministers, the governments in this country, actually pay to the advice coming out of the UN? I mean, do they just sort of go their own way, ignore it? I mean, and how does Britain compare with other nations around the world in terms of listening to the steer given by the United Nations?
Well, I mean, don't forget, the United States in the middle of the pandemic under Donald Trump actually withdrew funding to the World Health Organization. I mean, absolutely staggering. And then Trump called it the China virus. I mean, I do tend to make direct comparisons between the sort of extraordinary degree of deliberate irresponsibility by the Trump administration and compare it with what you might call, I suppose, Chris, British exceptionalism. This kind of, we're the best, so we know the best, we know what to do. Which I think, partly drove the British response. One of the most senior WHO spokespeople in recent years has been David Nabarro. He is the representative of the WHO to Britain. He speaks for the WHO. Frequently, you hear him on the media here. I've watched him over the years. He had the responsibility of speaking for the WHO at the UN over the avian flu outbreak, over SARS. That's what made me, first as a journalist, when I was there for Al Jazeera, and then subsequently when I worked for the Secretary General, I used to go and cover these press conferences. And so I was interested in, and learning more about the spread of viruses, especially when there wasn't a vaccine. And so, yes, I mean, look, I think it is probably true to say that we've got some brilliant scientists, some brilliant health professionals in this country. We've got a first-rate health service, despite all the cuts and everything that's thrown at it. I mean, the most extraordinary people, the most extraordinary dedication, wonderful frontline workers, and all of that. But British exceptionalism did mean that at the outset, I think there was a really serious question that had to be addressed at the Prime Minister. Why was he not picking up the phone immediately to the Chinese leadership, to the leadership in Korea, and to Taiwan, and to other countries in East Asia who've experienced in dealing and getting advice as to how best to handle what we knew by early January was heading our way?
I think it's very tempting to kind of look back. Everyone kind of goes back to the Attlee government and the spirit of 45 and say we need to do that. But there were major flaws because even that kind of Attlee spirit was very much still a kind of industrial socialism that was kind of, for want of a better turn of phrase, a kind of socialism for white straight people that lived in the United Kingdom and predominantly England at that. So we're now in a position, I think, where we actually have the opportunity to really make socialism manifest as it should. And that is the socialism that brings all of the working class together, whether you're straight, whether you're gay, whether you're trans, black, white, brown, wherever you are in the world. And I almost see the difference for me between sort of capitalism or centrism and 21st century socialism as, you know, the former is, right, we've got this queue for a handout or for some benefit or for some bit of attention, and we're all fighting about getting to be first in that queue, and it just pits working class people against other working class people. The kind of socialism that we have the opportunity to do now is the socialism where we're all in a circle together. We're building things, we're sharing things, and we're advancing all of our causes, because every single one of us deserves the right to live a life free from poverty and strife and prejudice. And that's what drew me to socialism in the first place. It's what gets me up every morning to fight for it today, is that sort of unity. And obviously we've seen repeatedly that current institutions, you know, the Labour Party being, you know, one of them, and the Democratic Party in the States being another one, that is not what they are interested in. That's not what they're looking at. The only time they seem to care about issues of race or gender or anything like that is a sort of tokenistic effort, which kind of overlooks the sort of structural barriers that mean people are held back, falsely held back from achieving their potential. And remember, every individual person's potential adds up to our collective potential as human beings, you know, as a community of people across the world. So it's a really dangerous ideology, and they've also embraced, you know, there is no alternative in whole, you know, the idea that there is no alternative to neoliberalism. So that queue where we're fighting to be at the front of it and not be at the back of it is all there is. And, you know, we've seen the impact of that with, you know, whole sections of, you know, particularly the white working class being lured away by, frankly, fascism, you know, the far right, because they go, well, if there's only this queue, I'm at least going to make sure I'm at the front of it. So I think that's kind of where we are. Where we go from here, I think.
What would your recipe be then, Kerry-Ann, to actually address this? If we feel that the Labour Party has embraced the Tina maxim that there is no alternative to neoliberalism, I mean, is socialism off the agenda now then? I mean, in terms of realistically implementing it, or what do we do if the Labour Party is not
never? Yeah, I agree with you. It's never been more important than it is right now, because neoliberalism is late stage. It's in disaster mode. You know, these people aren't even working anymore to you know, make their companies work or anything. This is a whole wealth extraction system that they're doing now. They're sort of rushing to the lifeboats and, you know, ferrying themselves off to their mansions while the rest of us suffer the consequences. Socialism has never been more important. And I think it's also important to remember there wasn't always a Labour Party. You know, the Labour Party, you know, isn't this aged institution that we've had for 400 or 500 years. You know, this is the Labour Party itself is a relatively new phenomenon in terms of human history. So the idea that we couldn't possibly recreate the socialist movement in a different form is frankly laughable. I think it's completely self-defeating. And I think it keeps people wedded to these institutions that are actually, in some ways, I think, distractions. They're kind of ways of containing our ambition rather than having it be fulfilled. So at this stage, with everything we've seen, I'm absolutely now for breaking away, creating grassroots movements. And I think there are many prongs to that. Political education has got to be key among them. Reminding people of what working class history and achievement has actually rested upon, because it's woefully absent from the discourse, certainly in my generation, and I think the generations below. You know, my grandparents' generation was certainly more political than my parents' generation. You know, the idea that you can't talk about politics, like politics is something you leave to the managers. You know, it's not something all of us participate in on a daily basis. So political education is one. Breaking away from institutions that have proven over and time again to fail us and not represent the very best of us, our spirit and our values. and I think actually to show it in action working.
Yeah.
I think, the idea of actually creating, the stuff you're talking about getting into local communities and creating socialist projects that actually meet people's needs real time, incredibly powerful, because that starts breaking down the biggest barrier in front of us, which is Tina, the idea that there is no alternative.
You mentioned the poll tax, and obviously that makes me feel old because it was over 30 years ago, Chris, that we were at the barricades melting down the Iron Lady and sending her off to the political knacker's yard where she belongs. But what was important, and what is an absolute lesson to take on board from those days, was the poll tax wasn't led by any political party. The poll tax was a grassroots campaign from the bottom up. In fact, the poll tax campaign was a product of being abandoned by the official political establishment. The trade union movement, the TUC, the Labour Party, they frowned on the idea of civil disobedience, because when you're fed up writing letters of protest, when you're fed up voting against particular politicians, when you're fed up signing petitions, what do you do next? I used to laugh, Chris, that the Labour Party in those days used to say that the poll tax was immoral. It was immoral. And I used to say to myself, well, see, if it's immoral, why are you telling us to pay it? If something's immoral, why are we paying it? And I couldn't understand that the absolute paucity of understanding of history, because without civil disobedience, of course, we wouldn't have trade unions, we wouldn't have a Labour Party, we wouldn't have a Labour movement. And here we had a campaign in 1989. We had it in Scotland first, as you know. We got it a year earlier than England and Wales. And we had a campaign that was set aside. It was for the nutters, it was for the malcontents, it wouldn't go anywhere. And of course, 1 year into it, there was 1 million people in Scotland refusing to pay the poll tax. Now, I have to say, Chris, not because of Tommy Sheridan or any other recruiting sergeant, the single biggest recruiting sergeant to the anti-poll tax army was poverty itself. People couldn't afford to pay. We have 30 years on, Chris, we have similar levels of deprivation, poverty. We have inequality that's way worse than what it was 30 years ago. It's obscene, the levels of inequality that we have in society, but we don't have a political party that articulates the anger. For a wee while there, Chris, I'm in Scotland, and I've got to say, I want to break the British Union, because the British Union, for me, represents imperialism, it represents exploitation, it represents everything that is wrong with society in terms of greed, and the way that they use slavery to build up their wealth and then refuse to apologise or give repatriation. So I want to break the British Union, and that's why Scotland politically, in my opinion, is different from England. It's also different from Wales, but I've got to say, I think there's evidence that Wales is catching up. I'm not sure there's evidence that England's catching up yet, Chris. I've got to say that. Maybe it's just that I'm not reading the right material or whatever. But what is clear is that Scotland is to the left on the political spectrum to England. And the evidence of that isn't just that we haven't voted for a Tory party for 65 years, but when England embraced that bumbling idiot Boris Johnson in December, Scotland rejected them, rejected everything that they stand for. And they've voted for a political party. And let's remember what this political party stands for. It's not a socialist party. SNP is not a socialist party. And yet it stands for unilateral nuclear disarmament. It stands for the abolition of the House of Lords. It stands for welcoming refugees. It stands for a publicly owned national health service. And crucially, it stands for Scotland having the right to reclaim its independence as a nation, as we once were. Now, all of that means then, Chris, that on the left in Scotland, and by the way, the SNP as a political party has its problems as well in terms of the direction it's going in. But right now, in the absence of any alternative, I would argue that socialists have to endorse a vote for the SNP to break the British Union. Once it's broken, and when I say break it, I don't mean just Scotland, I mean Wales, and I mean Ireland. A united Ireland, I think, is now closer than ever, and that's something that we should be celebrating as well. Once that happens, I think by example, if we do the right things in Scotland, if we implement a living wage instead of a poverty minimum wage, if we do have a publicly owned pharmaceutical industry that actually feeds our national health service instead of exploiting our national health service, if we have a national energy company that provides energy on the basis of need, not on the basis of private profit, these things can show an example to the working class of England who will say, hey, we want some of what the jocks are getting. We want to follow that example. And that's why, Chris, I would argue we are in a different situation in Scotland. That's not to say there isn't a need for a socialist movement in Scotland. There is. But there is a bigger need in England right now. And quite frankly, with what's been happening recently with Jeremy, if the left and the trade unions don't act now, they'll never act.
Well, I'll begin just saying that the idea that Joe Biden is going to move left, I think, is wishful thinking at best. I would say it's delusion. There's no indication whatsoever. There never was an indication. Joe Biden is a right-wing Democrat. His entire career has been as a right-wing Democrat. Under Barack Obama, he was even to the right of Obama, who is a neoliberal through and through, who talked about the importance of the free market, who oversaw one of the largest wealth transfers in history from the working class to billionaire oligarchs after the financial crisis. And we only expect at this moment that Biden is going to be even more to the right of the centrist, neoliberal, center-right Barack Obama administration. Of course, you all know as people from the UK, as Europeans, that the US is an extremely right-wing country when it comes to formal, bourgeois electoral politics. It's extremely right wing, and unfortunately, the Democratic Party has hinted in no way that it's going to move left. In fact, it's been the exact opposite. The Democratic Party every 4 years has continued to move further and further to the right, and with the Biden victory, it's only further confirmation to the Democratic Party's neoliberal leadership that their strategy of continuing to tag to the right is supposedly a successful one. We've already seen with the people that Biden has named, that the Biden-Harris transition team have named to oversee what they call their agency review teams. We see that the vast majority of them are neoliberals, corporate lobbyists. They, in the case of his so-called national security team, these are lifelong war hawks who supported the Iraq war, the Libya war, the Syria war, the war in Yemen, people who have worked for the weapons industry, who work for very aggressive, hawkish, neoconservative think tanks. There certainly is I don't think there's any realistic sign that Biden is going to move left. It's actually the contrary. He's going to continue to move right. And so this raises the important question that we're discussing today. Where will socialism potentially come from in terms of social movements in the United States? And I think the answer is that it can't come within the Democratic Party. And I think it's very similar, the situation in the U.S., to what you all have seen with the Labor Party, although I would argue that the U.S. is always maybe 20 years ahead when it comes to neoliberal policies. So it's been very clear since Bill Clinton's time that the Democratic Party is not a vehicle for the left wing. This was the rise of the third way Democrats. Bill Clinton wholeheartedly embraced neoliberal policies. In fact, Bill Clinton accomplished what Ronald Reagan was not able to do in privatizing welfare, essentially destroying welfare, in deregulating Wall Street, in deregulating the media, in doing so many things that the Republican Party, ostensibly the right-wing party, wanted to do. Well, it was actually the Democrats that, under the neoliberal leadership after the Clintonian turn, they were able to accomplish that. And we've seen under Obama and likely under Biden only a further continuation of that neoliberal trajectory, just as we saw with Tony Blair under the UK Labour Party. And you mentioned Bernie Sanders. You did say that Bernie Sanders, it seemed like he came out of nowhere. Well, what's interesting about Bernie is that he has been involved in U.S. politics in a formal way for decades. And he's an independent member of the Senate. He is one of the only independents who has ever been elected to the Senate in the history of the United States. There are very few. You can count them on two hands. And the fact that he was an independent is very important. He ran for president as a Democrat, but he's not a Democrat. He's an independent. And because there's no significant third party in the United States, and because our system is even less democratic than that of the United Kingdom, which certainly isn't very democratic either, but because we have this presidential system, it's even more difficult to build a third party alternative. I actually think in the UK, I think it's something that we have to do in the United States, and it's something that I encourage and have tried to be part of, encouraging the creation of a new third party, whether it be called a workers' party or a progressive party, or the name is not as important. That's secondary. What's primary is that we need an independent party that is not accountable to the Democratic Party's funding base, which is Wall Street, the pharmaceutical industry, the fossil fuel industry. And the reality is that in the US, that's even more difficult. But in the UK, with a parliamentary system, I think it's something that in the near term is a plausibility. In the United States, we're thinking kind of medium, long term.
Anything that comes out of these meetings is to be kept amongst ourselves. Isn't that marvellous that they haven't seen us because we've just caught a fox behind them? I mean, you've got to be very careful about who's saying what.
It's a lot easier to create a smoke screen if you've got more than one trail there operating. And that is what it's all about, trying to portray to the people watching that you're going about your legitimate business.
Oh, sorry, I've got one more thing. The police interviews, inquiries. By the police. I hope there are no police officers listening. There is no such thing as an off-the-record chat with a policeman.
You can't just pay stewards and think you can carry on and go hunting. And they will solve your problem.
So something for your hunt staff and terrier men, trail layers, everybody to consider. If you're recording evidence for a hunting act, trail laying, whatever, don't use the same phones or anything where you've been using the social media and bragging about what you've been doing out hunting. Because if the police get hold of it, you'll get both sides of it.
Bird of prey, the law states you can use a pack of dogs to flush a wild mammal to be hunted by a bird of prey. Now that's a terribly good wheeze for holding up, and I think that everyone during autumn hunting ought to be considering that.
Now, you know more about hunting than saboteurs or the courts will know. But what it will do is create that smoke screen or that element of doubt that we haven't deliberately hunted a fox.
Terrier work. This is our soft underbelly. A lot of people would say that if you're going trail hunting, why do you need terrier men following you around?
That looks like a conspiracy to conspiracy to commit break the law. I don't know what you think, Peter, but why do you think that hunting still persists to this day, Peter, given that it was banned in 2005?
Well, firstly, as one can see from this webinar, it has such great support in very high places. Obviously, the police aren't doing their job correctly, and we see two retired police officers advising this webinar hosted by Lord Mancroft, who speaks on behalf of hunting in the House of Lords. Also, there are so many holes in the Hunting Act itself, which allows it to be abused in the way it has been abused over the last 15 years. But what I find most disturbing about watching what I have watched of this webinar, I've watched certainly 19 minutes of it, and I know that the participants are saying, oh, well, everything is taken out of context. You're just using little bits and pieces without seeing the whole thing. Well, I've seen half the thing, and it seems to me to be absolutely clear that Lord Mancroft is hosting a webinar that is advising hunters how to deceive the police, the public, and get away with their horrible obsession, their hobby which is so depraved and destructive, which is killing poor innocent wildlife and particularly foxes. But what I found incredibly upsetting when I watched it was to see this group of course, incredibly well-placed people talking in such a civil manner about something as disgusting as fox hunting, treating it as if it were like discussing a game of billiards or, you know, any other harmful pastime. They're actually talking quite civilly and objectively about how they can pursue, hunt, and destroy an innocent animal. And when we consider that, depending on which poll you read, that between 80 and 90% of the UK are opposed to this disgusting pastime, I find it totally shocking.
Do you think that there is a fault in the way the legislation was drafted, though, Peter? I mean, at the end of the day, hunting is banned by law in theory, and yet we have what looked to me like a criminal conspiracy there to get around it. I wonder whether, you know, we should be arguing, should we, for tightening up of the loopholes that they're seeking?
Absolutely, without question. I think that there should be a tightening up of the loopholes. All of these little pulse access points that they can touch on, they've all got to be shut down, and so that they can't be abused in the way that they are. And also, I think that the local police have got to stand up and do their duty and not pretend that they can't see what's going on.
Roger. Break. Crazy Horse 1-8. Request permission to engage.
So the controller tells them they need to stop this evacuation of weapons and bodies.
Come on, let us shoot.
But it looks like the pilots understand that their commander will give the go signal if there is some interaction with weapons. So they seem to have this understanding that if people pick up the wounded, that is enough reason to get permission under the rules of engagement to kill them.
Request permission to engage.
Bushmaster 7, Roger. This is Bushmaster 7, Roger. Engage.
1-8, engage. Clear. Come on. Clear. Clear. We're engaged.
And you can see that they also deliberately target Saeed, the wounded man, on the ground. Despite their earlier belief that they didn't have the rules of engagement, that the rules of engagement did not permit them to kill Saeed when he was wounded. When he was rescued, suddenly that belief changed. But you can see in this particular image, he is lying on the ground and the people in the van have been separated, but they still deliberately target and kill him. This is why we called it collateral murder.
Unfortunately, Robert Sieber, who was due to join us this evening, Edward Snowden's lawyer, is unable to be with us this evening, but I'm delighted to introduce Kristen Hrafnsson, who's the editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, and Deepa Driver, who has spearheaded the Free the Truth campaign, which has been incredibly inspirational and has done so much to bring to the attention of the general public the plight of Julian Assange. But let me start by first of all going to Kristen and just ask Kristen if you could just give us your thoughts about two things really. One, what happened in the court hearing of Julian's show trial, if I can put it that way, but also what was contained in the Iraq war logs that were published 10 years ago tomorrow.
Well, it's incredible. Well, let me start to thank you for having me on here. It's incredible to think back, and that it's been 10 years since we had these stressful days in London preparing the release of these extremely important documents. 391,000 field reports from the US military, basically outlining the entire war in Iraq, in the words of the US military, from January 2004 to December 2009. This was unprecedented. This was the largest leak in military history and one of the largest leaks ever. and it was of a tremendous importance. It had a shocking effect on everyone that were diving into this material, because what it pertained was the brutal truth of the war, written by the invading armies into Iraq, and therefore they could not deny the authenticity of it or the truth that it was exposed there. It's hard to sum up all the stories that were mined in this material, but if I mention a few, it was the number of deaths and the fact that more than 65% of all the deaths that were registered were civilian deaths, and the fact that the U.S. military was actually keeping a record on the deaths in Iraq, which they had denied earlier and said on record that they were not counting bodies. They were lying. That was exposed. And what came out of this was more than 15,000 previously unreported civilian deaths. And in this release, we were working with the organization Iraq Body Count, who could add that to their sort of online memorial of those who lost their lives in this period. I mean, if we're talking about more than 30 civilian deaths every day during this period of this horrible war. In total, there was a reported 110,000 deaths in that period, and that was almost certainly way below the real numbers of the casualties in that period. There were other stories that sprang out there and which caused outrage. It was the incidents, the single incidents, the hundreds or thousands of incidents that added up. Incidents such as murdering civilians who were driving towards checkpoints and were driving too fast to according to the 18, 19-year-old soldier from the US who was manning the checkpoint, and opening fire, killing entire families. The soldiers who were singling out children and shooting them on the street. We're talking about the all the evidence of the torture, the rape, the murders that were recorded in these documents. And what was extremely damaging to the U.S. military and was the fact that they were observing from a distance, torturing, maiming, and killing of detainees by the Iraqi government. But they were ordered specifically by the top by Pentagon not to intervene, but collect the evidence and write reports. They should not intervene. That is basically a war crime in itself. This is sort of swept away the last sort of little inch of an attempt to legitimize this invasion and this horror. Before 2010, I believe there was an attempt by many to at least say, of course, we knew all about the lies that were used to justify the invasions at that point. But people were still saying and trying to justify this by saying, well, we had to get rid of Saddam Hussein. He was torturing and killing his citizens. But what we got there out of these reports was the evidence that under the shield of the U.S. military and the invading forces and the occupying forces, the puppet government in Iraq was basically doing the same thing. Without intervention, without any attempt to stop it, and by the U.S. military and the British forces as well. There were so many stories, and we were watching the Collateral Murder video, which I took a rich part in preparing. We released that on April 5th in 2010, and actually there is a report in the Iraq war logs pertaining to that incident. It is less than half a page, and it does not reflect the truth. All the individuals that are mentioned there as killed are called enemy combatants. So that gives you the idea of how things were categorized by the US military. That is absolutely untrue, of course, as you can see in the video evidence. I'd like to mention one other incident that was reported by the US military, and it actually pertains to the same helicopter unit that we saw in the collateral murder video with the call signal Crazy Horse 18. That incident was about two individuals who were being chased on a vehicle by the Apache helicopter. They shot upon the vehicle, immobilized it, and two individuals jumped out and threw away their weapons and signaled surrender to the Apache helicopter, who was hovering over. According to the report, the crew on the Apache helicopter called their base and asked what to do in the situation, because there were no ground troops nearby. And the reply came back, we have to, let's pass this one on to the lawyers at headquarters. And after the lawyers had been consulted, the reply came back, well, according to our handbook, you cannot surrender to an aircraft, so shoot them. So these are the horrific stories that when you have seen the Apache helicopter video, the collateral murder video, you can envision the horror and the criminality of this this in its entirety. We can maybe talk about the trial later, but I want to mention as well that this was a shocking evidence about the war, and which came relatively close in time after the start of the war, after the invasion. And I think that never before have we got this sort of in entirety the evidence of what happened in the war, in their own words, in the words of the US military. We, of course, were also breaking new ground in the way we were handling the material. It was very responsibly handled. It was heavily redacted. We were actually criticized for over-redacting the material, which is quite contrary to the claim that WikiLeaks was irresponsible and put people in harm's way by the publication, which is a hollow argument. We were working in the biggest media alliance ever put together at that time, working on a single project. It included not just the publications originally that we had worked with previously this summer, the German magazine Der Spiegel, the New York Times, and the Guardian. We also worked with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism to create content for a documentary on Channel 4, television content for Al Jazeera, both Arabic and English. We worked with Swedish television, Italian newspaper, and El País and Le Monde in France. So it was the biggest media alliance put together, and it actually created the understanding that this is the way to go forward, and this is now what everybody is trying to do with the limited resources that the mainstream media has today. Just as an opening to sum up, I mean, it was basically the entire truth of the Iraq war that was exposed, and no one has been able to try to spin that in any way. It's impossible. The truth is there. It is still there. Maybe we haven't come in terms with how to deal with it in our democratic societies. We have to accept that this was done on our watch, and even though we can claim it was not in our name personally, it was our leaders who took part in that and bear the responsibility. No one has been brought to justice for the obvious war crimes that were exposed there, and I think we still have a way to go to come to terms with how we're going to justify all these wrongdoings that happened on our watch, basically. But that is for the future. But the evidence is there. It's online. It will not go away, and we have to go back to that.
Like many people, while I was aware of the courage and the excellent work that Julian and Kristen and Joseph and others have done at WikiLeaks, I had not realized that when Julian took asylum in the embassy, I hope you can still hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yep.
The conditions that Julian was under was so horrendous. And it was when Julian, as we got to know that Julian was being dragged out of the embassy, that I really started to pay attention very closely. And it came as a real shock to me to find out that for years while he was in the embassy, he had a terribly nasty tooth infection and a serious shoulder injury, in addition to a long-term chronic lung condition since 2012. And the British government had not allowed him to have basic medical treatment. And given the way we treated war criminals and dictators like Pinochet, for example, it was just appalling to see this. When he was dragged out of the embassy, I couldn't believe it had happened, because despite being from a former colony of Britain and recognizing the horrors that colonialism brought to other parts of the world, I had quite seriously expected some element of the rule of law to be upheld in Britain, and to find British politicians complicit in the way Ecuador's sovereignty was violated, and how the Ecuadorians were pushed into or bribed into doing what they did to Julian really bothered me. That's when I started to pay very serious attention. And when Julian was taken into Belmarsh, that really was the last straw for me. I began to get involved with the grassroots movement, and also started to attend all the hearings, including the administrative hearings. And more recently, I've been the legal observer for the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers, attending all the days of the trial at the Old Bailey. And what John Sloboda, who was one of the expert witnesses at the trials, he's the co-founder of Iraq Body Count, said was that the Iraq war logs were the single largest contribution to public knowledge about civilian casualties in Iraq. They revealed an estimated 15,000 previously unknown deaths. 10 years on, the Iraq war logs, he says, remain the only source of information regarding many thousands of violent civilian deaths in Iraq between 2004 and 2009. By making this information public, Manning and Assange were carrying out a duty on behalf of the victims and the public at large that the US government was failing to carry out. And this, we talk about Black Lives Matter, and we're in Black History Month right now. And it is atrocious to see the way in which Black lives all over the world are being destroyed by British and American war crimes. And until Julian and WikiLeaks allowed, I remember going to a session where Patrick Coburn was speaking, the journalist, and he was saying that those on the ground in Iraq, some of the experts like him, knew this was going on, these crimes were going on, but they didn't have the proof. And why didn't they have the proof? And this comes back to your question as to why the journalists are so quiet. It's because the journalists were censoring or self-censoring the information that is made available to the public about the crimes that our governments commit in our name. And this is what we need to deal with. And it is in this regard that I think it is shameful to see the absolute absence of serious mainstream critical journalism in relation to Julian's case. Yes, there has been coverage of the case. And I've seen some excellent articles from, say, John Pilger, from Charles Glass, Fidel Narvaez wrote an excellent one, Marjorie Cohn wrote something. And these are some excellent articles that have come out. But if across those 4 weeks of the trial, if you look at the kinds of people who were, what were we talking about on the BBC? They had a journalist in court every day, almost every day. Was any report of any meaning done? And this shows you how terribly skewed the court process was, for even in terms of basic open justice. On the first day, 40 civil society organizations found out that they no longer had access to the court. Those of us who were members of the public who were queuing outside to get into the court, to the public gallery, there were 2 courts in operation, one with the trial, one which was an adjacent court. Both courts had 33 seats each in the public gallery, so 66 seats across the 2 public galleries. How many members of the public were allowed into court? 2. And on parts of the day, 5. It's only at the end of week 3 that the seats that were reserved for VIPs by the judge were even released to the public after complaints from civil society organizations that these people who were VIPs had not shown up in the first 3 weeks. I'm shocked and horrified at the journalists who were sitting in the court, many of whom not just didn't report about the case. I saw one who came in and ate a sandwich and read a newspaper and went away. There were, of course, some good journalists, and huge credit to them, both covering it online and covering it in the room. But there were others who seriously do not seem to want to understand what is going on. I saw a comment from the BBC online from one of their journalists saying that the reason they weren't covering it is because it was repetitive.
Yes.
Rape, murder, torture, the potential to poison the defendant, spying on the defendant, the governments colluding on spying on a sovereign embassy on British soil, and the British being complicit in that. The city of not the city of London, the city, not what do you call it, the Mayor of London's office approving the budget for the Metropolitan Police to spend tens of millions of pounds surveilling both the public outside and Julian, and this was allowed in the name of justice, supposedly. I mean, this is just horrendous, and this makes me ashamed to think that I even thought there would be a semblance of justice.